We're here at entry 31 now. This is Thursday, June 4th of 1964, and this is a two-page entry, and it's pretty important. It's about a very important meeting you had.
Yes, that's correct. The commission was now at the point where it had to make some decisions about interviewing the widow, Mrs. Kennedy, or bringing her as a witness before the commission, and secondly, trying to determine whether the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, should appear in person before the commission or submit some kind of a statement to it. So I was, of course, the liaison in this respect, and I went to consult initially with Ed Guthman. Ed was the public information officer and a very close confidant of the Attorney General, and he and Nick Katzenbach were the two that I wanted to consult with respect to this matter to see how we should approach the Attorney General. And Ed was very cooperative and receptive. We discussed this for some time, and he basically took the view that if there was a way to let the Attorney General meet the needs of the commission without necessarily appearing before it, that might be desirable. As to the interrogation of Mrs. Kennedy, Ed and I went to a visit with Nick Katzenbach about the subject, and I had come back after the initial meeting with Ed. I came back to meet with Ed and with Nick Katzenbach, and Nick had another alternative with respect to the Attorney General appearing. He suggested maybe the needs of the commission could be met by a letter from the Chief Justice to the Attorney General, and a response to that letter by the Attorney General, which would do what the Commission wanted to hear from many cabinet officers, namely, one, that the person had confidence in the Commission, two, his organization had cooperated fully with the Commission, and thirdly, he was aware of no information that might suggest there was any kind of a conspiracy with respect to the assassination. And of course, those three issues were very easy for the Attorney General to make, because among other reasons, he had withdrawn from any supervisory authority over the department after the assassination of the president. So we went to, eventually then, we went before the Attorney General and discussed these issues. He was particularly interested in what the commission wanted to do with Mrs. Kennedy, and he agreed that she should be interviewed, but he thought that the Chief Justice and Rankin would be the people who should do this, and he wanted to be present. And he wanted to hear what we wanted to question her about and make the arrangements subsequently. So those were the issues that were on the table during this set of meetings that involved at least two or three meetings over a short period of time, until we finally reached some agreement with respect to her appearance and the kind of statement that he might make to the commission.
Viewers might be curious to know why there was any interest in having Robert Kennedy testify in the first place, since he wasn't part of the Texas trip.
That really was one of the primary reasons I thought could justify his not appearing in person. Unlike the president and many other people who were in the motorcade, he had nothing to contribute to the events of that day, or specifically the facts surrounding the motorcade at the time of the assassination. And furthermore, his department, unlike the State Department, for example, really had no involvement in any part of Oswald's life in Russia or in the United States. So there was nothing to contribute on that score. I think his appearance would have been perfunctory and raised, I don't think, any serious issue one way or the other, unless there were people who wanted to probe him about his knowledge of the assassination plots. But of course, that was not on our agenda, and we knew nothing about that at the time. And there's a controversy as to the extent to which Bob Kennedy possessed personal knowledge of of those plans at the agency, the CIA. He was, on a personal level, a very, very friendly, calm. He always seemed fully in control. This was a meeting he was interested in knowing what the commission was doing. And I thought, with respect to his personal appearance and knowledge, it would be useful to read one paragraph of this entry on page 2. And it reads as follows. As to his own participation, he indicated he did not wish to be a witness, although he did not come out and state this. He did express himself as being willing to do anything necessary for the country, and thought that his making a statement about the non-existence of a conspiracy would be desirable. He took a look at the draft letter that I had prepared and found it inaccurate, in that he never received any reports from the FBI in regard to the assassination, and that his only sources of information about the assassination were the Chief Justice, Deputy Attorney Katzenbach, and myself. He stated that he was perfectly willing to make a broad and definite statement regarding his confidence in the Commission and the adequacy of the investigation based on the reports that he had received from the Chief Justice, Mr. Katzenbach, and me. We left it that I would draft these letters and we would proceed along this course of action. And then we went on to have a conversation before I left about how the Commission was doing, and I reported that I thought they were doing a good job, but that there was much criticism that could be made about the performance of the Secret Service, and he shared his view that he thought they had done a terrible job, and he wanted the Commission to explore changes that might improve the operations in the future. And in the last couple sentences of the memo, I report that, quote, Mr. Katzenbach expressed his view that the FBI would be much better suited to handle this responsibility than the Secret Service, and then, quote, the Attorney General told me to tell the Commission to consider this issue, unquote. So I left the meeting with clear direction from the Attorney General as how I should instruct the Commission how to proceed.
This is the most liaison you've been so far, I think, in the work of the Commission. The paragraph you read, I'm curious as to the Attorney General's tone when he mentioned that the FBI had not been keeping him informed. He had only been hearing about it from the Chief Justice and Mr. Katzenbach. Did he seem perturbed in any way that the FBI wasn't
No, that was a result of his decision.
Okay.
Immediately upon the assassination, he withdrew officially from his responsibilities in any way for this, for investigation of the assassination or for relating to the Commission. And so, even though all the FBI reports that followed November 22 that were addressed to him did not, in fact, go to him, they went only to Katzenbach and to Miller. Mm-hmm. So that's why he could say with this level of confidence, because he had deliberately decided to withdraw.
He recused himself by the very nature of being the president's brother.
Correct.
Okay. We should talk a moment about the questions that were prepared for Mrs. Kennedy, because you mentioned that there was a great number of questions that Mr. Spector prepared. It was whittled down first by Mr. Katzenbach, and then the Attorney General cut it down even more beyond that. Can you give us a sense of the type of detail that Spector was looking for in these questions?
Well, it was a list of about 110 or 120 questions, and it went all the way from the arrival. It involved events preceding the motorcade, and it involved events subsequent to the motorcade. For example, questions about what she saw and heard at the hospital. And it also included some questions about her thoughts about presidential protection in a general sense. In other words, it was not limited to the 30 seconds or so involving the motorcade and the death of her husband. And so I took the liberty, I forget whether I had Rankin's approval or not, I knew he would want this list critiqued and shortened if possible. And so I honed it down to eliminate virtually all the questions before the motorcade began, with maybe a few introductory questions, and most of the questions involving events after the assassination. That is to say, at Parkland Hospital, and then subsequently the return to Washington in a plane that contained the body of her husband. And when she was wearing the blood sprinkled pink overcoat or dress, whatever it was she was wearing at the time. So both Rankin sort of, accepted most of my deletions and may have added some of his own. And so what I eventually presented to Nick Katzenbach, I guess, still had questions of questionable value, and the whole idea of trying to interrogate this woman on any matters other than pertain directly to the event seemed to me to be inappropriate, and particularly since we were well aware by this time that she did not even remember crawling out on the back of the car pursuing the remnants of her husband's brain, to be crude about it. And so perhaps I was overly sympathetic to the circumstances, but I know that was the sentiment of the Attorney General and the Katzenbach, and I shared those sentiments, and they were not forced on me. And so it was left uncertain who actually would participate, but the Attorney General eventually proceeded to schedule the interview within a few days, as I recall. We may have some entry about it in the journal, and I guess we can save what happened at that and the consequences for a discussion shortly.
Around this same time, I don't think it's recorded in the journal, but there was also a question of whether President Johnson would be called to testify. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So both the president and Mrs. Johnson were scheduled to be witnesses, and I forget exactly how it was handled, but the end result was that the president and Mrs. Johnson submitted their statements by letter, by a formal statement. So it wasn't an affidavit, and they did not appear. And I think the staff generally met. The staff, I think, shared the view that it would be advantageous for the president to appear, and his wife as well, but the president in particular, to show his confidence in the commission and the fact that he was perfectly able and willing to come forward to testify about what he saw at that event and any other views he wanted to put on the record. I think that would have been a constructive step to make. And I do not know who in the White House advised him on this matter, and I do not know the reasons why he chose not to appear and chose not to give an affidavit, but rather sought this other means of getting on the record with respect to his thoughts about the commission's work.
And finally, just before we move on, the Attorney General asks you, as you read, to tell the Commission to consider the issue of presidential protection, and he makes the statement that the consideration that perhaps the Secret Service should fall under the FBI. It seems, in retrospect, an odd thing for Robert Kennedy to say, considering the antagonistic relationship he had with J. Edgar Hoover, but I suppose it also speaks to the lack of confidence he had in the Secret Service.
No, that's absolutely right. And I recall the Attorney General saying that he didn't have strong views in favor of the FBI either. There was some confusion in discussing the possible role of the FBI. I mean, in Dulles' view, for example, the FBI would take over the intelligence function, but not the physical surrounding of the president and protecting the president at the scene of his appearance, whether it was in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. So there were those who thought the whole responsibility might be sent to the Department of Justice, but that would mean then that the FBI would deal with the intelligence. It was unclear who would actually do the policing, the shaping and planning for visits to different cities or states or countries, and where the police force would be assembled to actually protect the president wherever he went. So there was never very clearly thought out, but obviously the Attorney General had serious questions about both the Secret Service and the FBI, but as you suggest, he had more confidence overall in the FBI, perhaps because there would be some supervision available at the departmental level and cabinet level, anticipating, without saying so, that there would in the future be an FBI without J. Edgar Hoover.
I know we'll come back to presidential protection in a later entry, so we'll wrap it up here.